Howdy there, folks. In today's tutorial, we're going to build upon the Getting Started with Vue and XState video I recently created. And if you'd like to check that out, please go ahead and click the card in the corner of the screen. In that video, we learned how to set up XState to create a finite state machine and then use this in our Vue components using a Vue composable function. Today, we're going to look into using XState with Typescript to provide well-defined types for our various states and the type of the context that can accompany those states. Our state machine will give us the ability to fetch data from an asynchronous API and also give us the ability to retry in case of failure. As an example, I have this open. If I click fetch, you see a little loading here and we get an error. So I have an API for demo purposes that will fail regularly. So let's click retry, loading, and usually it fails 4 out of 5 times. And so you can see the fetch is disabled, but then it re-enabled. So if we get valid data, we'll add a little delay until we can refetch data. So that'll be another feature. Furthermore, we'll also learn how to use this development tool that we instantiate in our Vue application called XState Inspect. And what it does is when we load an app, it links up the state with the app into a nice little state machine diagram here. And so we can see our current state. We can see that we're in the ready state, meaning we've already fetched some data and we can fetch again. So if I click fetch here, it'll show that we can be loading, and I should probably add some time to that for you to see, but you see that we get in the failure state, and it's also in the failure state in our app. So we'll also learn this really cool development tool. Now, the UI isn't fancy here, but I think you all are Vue developers and you know how to use CSS, so I want to focus on the actual state today. To get started, I want to scaffold out an application with Vite, which is called Next Generation Front-End Tooling. If we go to Get Started, we can see a command for creating or initializing a Vue app with this tool. So this is an alternative to the Vue CLI, and the Vue CLI uses Webpack to bundle all of the dependencies, whereas this tool uses native ES modules and is a little bit faster and lightweight. We want to create a Vue Typescript project as shown here. So let's go ahead and copy this command. And we'll open a terminal. I'll shut down that previous dev server I had, and we'll run this command. Now I'm going to call this app, let's call it the last one I called Vue XState Async Practice. So let's call this Vue XState Async. And maybe we'll call it live. And I'll upload this to GitHub when we're done. And if you remember, we use Vue TS. Let's double check that. Yes, Vue-TS to scaffold out a TypeScript application. You'll see the dependencies are a lot less for this than if we were using the VCLI. Sometimes that means you have to add your own ESLint config. Some stuff's not coming out of the box. So it may take a little more effort in that regard, but really the live reloading and development experience is awesome. Let's now CD into this folder. And I have a whole bunch of these. I don't think there's anything secret there. All right, so let's CD into there and npm install. And there aren't too many packages, so this should be quick, and then we can run this baby. All right, npm run dev. All right, let's open this, and we have your default template here with a counter. Okay, I've now opened up the application inside of VS Code in this async live folder, and the first thing that I want to do is to look at our main.typescript file here. You may see that you have an error for importing app.vue, and I wanted to mention that the TypeScript support that's coming with this Vite configuration here is using a package from a sort of new library called the Vue Developer Experience, so @VueDX, and this relies on the local version of TypeScript. So this might happen in your case that you're loading your global TypeScript. So if you just click in TypeScript here, you can then go up and choose Select Typescript Version, or you can hit Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P and use Select Typescript Version here if you're in VS Code, and make sure you choose your node modules TypeScript like so. And now importing of the app view modules works. And that's because these libraries handle treating Vue as TypeScript modules, which basically means that we can import them like we would any other TypeScript or JavaScript file. And furthermore, these types are set up for us automatically if we go to Vite config. Actually, no, TypeScript config.json. You can see that some types are included for the Vue developer experience TypeScript plugin view. And so that's how this is all handled for us. I just wanted to mention that so you do not lose a half hour trying to figure that out like I did. We're going to really clean up this app now. We're not going to use any components. We're going to do everything in a single app.vue file, so we don't need that little assets logo. Chaucito. Let's go to app.vue, and let's just put an H1 restaurants. I keep saying it like that. I don't know. Restaurants. There we go. Say it like a true American there. All right. We don't import this file anymore. We'll leave the app component as name, but we're not bringing in any imports. Okay, we're exporting a default import, and we do not need this. If I now run npm run dev, this should load a simple H1 tag. And you can see it now. Sorry to bother you with config, but I'm just going to add a little prettier rc.yaml file here with some basic config for my application. And you may see that I get some type helping and formatting here. I didn't set up ESLint for this project. I'm just using some very default settings that come with an extension called Vite, which will validate my templates and the stuff in my script tag for TypeScript. And it is this one here. Let's now shut down our development server and let's set up, remember I showed you that little tool, if we go here, that shows our state machine. Let's configure our application to use this now. I'm going to install 3 separate npm packages. The first is XState, and that gives us the raw or basic TypeScript library of XState for creating these state machines. I'm going to install @XState Inspect, which gives us the ability to look at that diagram of state machines, and then add XState View, which gives us a composable function, which we used in the last tutorial, to send events to our state and access the current state context and actually what the state value is itself. To set this puppy up, we go to main.ts, and we need to import inspect from @XState Inspect. And I set up my prettier to use semicolons, so they all got added there. And to use inspect, we just have to set up a simple configuration object with this function. And we're going to set iframe equals false so that it will open in a new tab or browser window. And in my case, it will open in a new tab. I think you can kind of set up and mount an iframe in a div if you want the developer tool to appear in a specific place, but I'm perfectly fine with it opening in another window. Now, let's go ahead and create a very basic machine. We'll call it fetch machine. I'm just a fetch machine. And then we will create this using the create machine function that is provided by XState like so. We import that, and then we'll call it fetch machine, and we're just going to give it an ID, which you can apply to every machine. We'll provide an initial state, which will be called initial, and then we'll put that in our states, because you can't have initial state, because you cannot have an initial state unless it is also defined here, and you would see a runtime error if you do not define it both here and here. Let's save this file and go back to app.vue. And in the view component, and we use define component to help us get better TypeScript help. So you might not be used to exporting your components with this inside of this define component function, but it's very useful for TypeScript. Anyway, let's add a setup method. And in here, we're going to use the useMachine hook. This useMachine hook, if you remember, is provided by the @XState/view library. So we don't have this. Do I have auto imports? Yeah, maybe not. Let's go ahead and import a useMachine. And this is a global library, which is @XState/view, which I just mentioned. And we also need to import the actual fetch machine that we just created. So that is in a sibling directory, and it is the default export. So no need for curly braces, just like so. All right, let's run this app and we'll see our little state machine with a single state. Great, and you saw how fast that was. That's the full-time first load, and it's even faster for updates. So let's open this. And I guess I have it open twice. Let's close the originals, but you can see it quickly opened the app, and then it opened the state charts IO. You may get a warning about pop-ups. You'll need to clear that and then reload your application if you have that error. But so far, we have a single event called, or state called initial. In this application, we're going to work with a fake little API that returns restaurants. So I just want to create a file called global for just some global types for this application. And I've done this differently in other apps. I might put it in a certain application layer, but let's just create a type of DTS that can be seen by the whole application. And we'll define an interface for restaurant, which needs to have an ID as number, a name as a string, a rating as number, and a review as a string. Let's also create a data folder where we'll add the basic array for the data that we're going to fetch. So I'll just put this in an index.ts file. And then we're going to add an array of just some restaurants here. You can add what you want or go to the repository and download them. So we're going to make restaurants as an array of restaurants, and I've added 4 of them here. All right, next, let's create that fake API. And remember, I want to make an API that fails a certain percentage of the time. So we're going to export a method that returns a promise, because that's going to be very important for how we use this in the state machine. And so it's an async function. I'll use the async await syntax and define its return type. And we're going to sleep for 500 seconds. The sleep function is just a simple function that wraps a promise. In fact, let's make this a full second so we can better see what our application is doing. And then we're going to just create a random number between 0 and 1. And if it's less than 0.8, we're going to throw an error. Otherwise, we'll return the restaurants above. Pretty friggin' simple if you ask me, and very unreliable as well. So let's go back to our fetch machine and start defining what the types and the context look like, and the events as well. Remember that when we create a state machine, we define these sort of finite states that we can go between, but we also define something called a context. And the context holds numerical data, kind of data that can be continuous or can be anything. So we don't have a discrete number of restaurants that could be populated in an array, and we could receive any number of arrays from our API. What we're going to do next is create our possible states, and each state will also have an accompanying possible context. What we're allowed to do when we create these so-called type states that we're going to create is it allows us to narrow the context. What I mean by that is, in some states, you might know that there is not going to be an error. For example, if you successfully fetch the restaurants, it shouldn't be possible to access an error when you're in the success state. And we want this compile time help of TypeScript if possible, and that's what these type states allow us to do. So I'm going to copy a whole bunch of context and states here, and let's try to make sense of it. All right. Let's first, before we look at these individual contexts, I want to look at our possible states. When we define these so-called type states, we create a type and a name. And then for each state, we define a value. Now the value is the same value that you're going to put in your state's configuration here. And the context is the narrowed down context for that state. We're going to have 5 states. The initial state is before we've ever tried to fetch anything. The ready state is for when we are ready to fetch. The loading state is anytime we're in the middle of fetching data. And the success state is when we have valid data and we can clear an error. And then we have a failure state, which is perhaps after the loading state if the call to our promise fetch restaurants method fails. Then we define the overall state as a discriminated union of these various types. This is kind of a way of saying that our state must be either initial state or ready state or loading state or success state or failure state. And I'm exasperated now. But it can only be one of these states at a time. Now for the context. The context narrows what fields we can have on the context depending on the state. So if we're in the initial state, we know that we have an undefined error and restaurants. So this will help us in our view template to know that, hey, if state is initial, you have no access to restaurants or an error, so you can't display them in your template when you're in the initial state. When we're ready, this is after we've successfully fetched data, and then we're going to set a little timeout before we can refetch. I probably could have given this a better name. In that case, we will have restaurants, but there will be no error present. Now you may be asking, what is this AND symbol? This is called an intersection of types. And so it basically merges this original fetch context with whatever type we put in the curly braces here. And this is how, again, we narrow the type, or we're more specific about the type. Now, the documentation for XState doesn't actually write all these types out. They sort of create the state here, and then in context, they put this whole thing in context. But I just wanted to type them out individually, even though it takes more lines of code. When we're in the loading state, I'm actually going to say that we do have restaurants. Now you may be saying, what if you're in your first initial state, you don't have restaurants? We'll see how we handle these restaurants soon enough. And then if we successfully loaded restaurants, we have restaurants, but no error. All right, that was a lot of talking, but let's now apply these to our create machine. And actually, before we do that, let's go ahead and create the definition of our events, or in other words, the types of our events. And let me remove that tab. So we're going to have fetch events, which are either of type fetch or of type retry. Now let me note that you could also add some payload that you want to define that must come with this event, but we're not actually sending any payload with our events. Maybe, for example, if you wanted to fetch a user of a particular ID, then you would add an ID of number here or something. Now, to make our fetch machine know about these states, we're going to add them as generic types to the create machine function. We'll add the fetch context goes first, the event type goes second, fetch event, and the state goes last. I also want to add an initial context. Remember that we have restaurants, and I want the initial ones to be undefined, and I want the error to be undefined. Now this is an area where I don't know why we're not getting type help here for the context, because we know the initial context must have restaurants and errors of undefined, and we define initial here. It's probably not as easy said as done, as entering and leaving these states allow us to modify the context when we do that. But I know there are a lot of updates coming in version 5 of XState, so maybe we'll see some improvement on the typings of these kind of things. I now want to add some baseline for the states. Let's get rid of initial, and I'll just copy what I had. So our possible states are initial, which can receive a fetch event And if we have a fetch event, we'll go to loading here. Now, right now, we don't have anything in loading, but this is where we will reach out to our fetch restaurants method. We have a ready method, which also allows us to go into the loading state. And we have a success state. And the success state allows us to go back to the ready state after 250 milliseconds. So this after is pretty cool when you're talking about not wanting to ping your API too many times, for example. Then we have a failure state. And the failure state has the ability to receive a retry event, which will then take us to the loading and attempt to refetch. And probably we should put a little delay on this too, so you're not just load, failure. But anyway, this is good for a demo application. Let's now look particularly at this loading state here. So how do we reach out to our API from here? We can use something called an invoke property. Invoke allows us to invoke other state machines from within the current state machine. We can even dynamically spawn and destroy other state machines and return their responses to our current machine. This follows the so-called actor model, which you may be familiar with in languages like Scala and some functional programming languages out there, maybe Haskell. Now, does this sound complex? Well, it kind of is. If you go to the to-do list example on the XState docs, it's relatively complex, let's be friggin' honest. But thankfully, XState provides some basic machines that we can use for callbacks, promises, and I also believe RxJS observables. Let's see how we can use this invoke method with our method fetch restaurants that returns a promise. So we create an invoke object, and we provide an ID. Just like we provide an ID to this machine, this invoke is kind of its own machine. So we'll call it the getRestaurants machine. Then we must define a source, and this source receives a method which gets access to the current context. And that's referring to whatever these restaurants or errors are, and the event that caused us to get to the loading state. And from this, we're actually just going to return a call to fetch restaurants. And we need to import that. Let's make sure that imported up top. Yes, we had auto import. Great. Next, this sort of machine, when we invoke a promise or even a callback, I think provides us with an onDone method or object actually. And so if the promise successfully completes, if it resolves, then this onDone state will be reached. And from onDone, or I guess maybe an event, I'm not sure, but we're going to have a target state of success. And then when this happens, I also want to use assign, and we need to import assign from XState. Very good. Let's scroll back down. And so here we're going to assign, and this is used to update values in the context, if you recall. We're going to assign restaurants, and this receives the context and the event. Now, the event in this case is going to contain data from the success response of fetch promises, or whatever the promise resolves to, and it will be on the event.data. And that's provided to us by XState when we use invoke with a promise. So we know if it resolves, we will have an event.data. I'll add some trailing commas that I prefer. And then we're also going to have an onError possible event. Or I guess state. And in this case, if we have an error, let's go to the failure state that we already created. And we're also going to assign restaurants here. So we're going to use actions to assign our restaurants to undefined. And you may not do this. You may choose to keep whatever the previous restaurants were. But in my case, I want to eliminate the restaurants and then store an error. So again, if we have an error, we're going to assign our restaurants undefined. And similar to getting the resolved value in event.data, if the promise is rejected or throws an error like ours does, we can access that error on event.data. Now, I did previously mention that our loading state will always have, where is it here? We'll always have a context with restaurants. Now, that may be a little funny, but we can make sure we always have restaurants inside of an entry key. So we can, as we assign values, we can use the entry to also assign our context. And when I said assign values, I mean assign context. And so I can make sure that we have restaurants. We will do it like so. We take the restaurants key, and what we're going to do is say, hey, if there are context restaurants, meaning from the previous context before we enter the loading state, go ahead and return them. But if this is a falsy value, then return an empty array of restaurants. So this will make sure we have either the previous restaurants before loading or an empty array. And then we'll also set the error to undefined, because when we start loading, we want to clear out any errors. All right, that's kind of a lot without showing view, but let's actually go now to our browser and let's refresh the application. And here we go. Here's our entire state machine. So we can fetch, and then, okay, we either have a done, and if we have done for get restaurants, it's going to go to the success state. I guess these lines aren't so clear, but if we have an error, it goes to the failure, which has a retry event to send us back to loading. Now, right now, you can actually see the current context doesn't have any restaurants, and you'll see that this error is empty, and so there must be something wrong with this dev tool that I can't see the error, but we will see in our application that we can get the error message in payload. I don't know why it doesn't show it here. I know I complain a lot, but today my dog is really barking. Anyway, let's retry. And again, it waits a second to either resolve or reject. It rejected. And let's keep retrying until we get to success. All right, this is, it's defying probability now. I'm probably going to have to cut this out. Okay, there we go. And about a minute of your life was wasted. Okay, so now we have that list of restaurants we created. And then you see this after, fires after 250 milliseconds and takes us back to the ready state. And we still have our restaurants in this state, but you see there's no error when we get back to the ready state. So the only thing I don't know about is why the error doesn't show in the context correctly, but it will in the application. Let's now work on the view application. Let's go back to app.view here. We're already using the machine, but to be able to access this machine from the template, remember in the setup function, you want to return anything that you want to access in the template. So to have access to the state and our send method, we'll return it from setup. I'm also going to add a simple button style so that they don't butt up right against each other. So just a simple margin of 8 pixels. That's the extent of styles today. Let's now add a button to fetch data. So here is the button, and when we click, we're going to send fetch. However, we want to disable this button if the state is not ready or initial. So if we're in any other state than ready or initial, we should not be able to fetch. So if we're in an error state, we should not fetch. We should only be able to use a retry button. So we're going to create a separate button for retrying. Now, one thing that's nice is let's go ahead and maybe change this to fetchy. Now save. There's an error, and it tells us that our events must be of type fetch. It's a little hard to see. Here it is, type fetch or type retry. And so we have this union event type. So that's really nice. And I guess it's even nicer because we can do it as a type as an object. And then that's when we would include the payload in this object. Or we can just send it as the key. So it actually handles the two type of ways that we can send an event for us, which is pretty cool. Now, my dev tools, I noticed, and this is probably just a problem with Vite and its ability to use TypeScript in template blocks, but it doesn't help me to say fetch here. So that's something that could be improved, but it's not the hugest deal. At least it tells us when we've gone wrong. And similar for these. There is no state called ready. It makes us use the states we define. So this is just awesome. Let's now add the retry button. And I guess we could have made the retry button the same as the fetch button, but just to distinguish that we only want to be able to retry if we're in the failure state. So this is only enabled if we're in the failure state and it's otherwise disabled. Then I want to add just a simple span next to these buttons as a loading indicator. So if our state matches loading, then just show some, loading text. Now, in what states do we want to show the restaurants? Well, we can have restaurants if we're ready, because we've already successfully fetched data in the ready state. And let's maybe go back to our diagram to make this clear. So if we are in ready, we could still have restaurants because we come from the success state to the ready state. Or if we're loading, we could still have the previous restaurants, right? Before they've updated to new restaurants. And of course, in the success state, we can also have restaurants before we go back to ready. So we're going to add a div to show our restaurants. And this will also iterate through the restaurants. Great, so we're going to say if our state is ready or success or loading, then we're going to use a v4 and the key will have the restaurant ID in state.context.restaurants, and we'll iterate over these and show the restaurant rating and a review of it in paragraphs. Now, if we go here, can we get type helping? Let's see, state context. Good. And unfortunately, I don't know why it's not showing restaurants here. Okay, now it does. But that's interesting that it's saying of type any. It ought to know that our context has an array of restaurants. So maybe that could also, again, be our tooling in the templates. Let's actually check that out. I should have done this, beforehand, but let's just say const restaurants equals state. Now, since we're in the template, this is a ref, so we actually have to do state.value.context. And this one seems to know that we have a possibility of restaurants, though it says it could be any or undefined. So that's kind of interesting. Maybe there's a problem, maybe I'm doing something wrong, but definitely that would be nice to have. So lastly, below this div, I just want to add a div that will hold the possible error message. And so if the state is failure, I want to get from the context the error message. And it's interesting that this is showing the error, so maybe I'm doing something a little off here. Let's now see if this is working. Okay, I have it open twice. Let's maybe do a hard refresh. And maybe we'll see an error, and that's why I wasn't getting the restaurants correctly. Let's see if we can. Let's empty this, and let's see if we fetch here. Loading. Okay, we got restaurants. And let's see if we're back in the ready state. So we went to the success state and back to ready. Let's fetch. Loading. Wow, successful twice in a row. Something's crazy. There we go. All right. And so now we can retry. And you see we get error loading restaurants, and we get the message could not fetch restaurants. And if you recall, we're using the actual error's message, and that error message is defined, in the data index as could not fetch restaurants. And so remember when I looked at the state diagram, we weren't seeing this message or the error type. So maybe it can't display certain class objects or something. Let's retry one more time until we get back to the restaurants. There we go. Here are all of our restaurants. So it turned out, remember how I could not get the restaurant type here on the context of restaurants as an array of restaurants? It turns out that I just had to restart my language server here, my Vite server. So there's some stuff a little buggy still about evaluating TypeScript and templates, but that was the problem. I looked at my other code that I'd already written 20 times, and it turns out that there was just something a little funky with the dev tool, I think. Now, very important is to look at this context. You can see that it knows that since we're in a state that matches ready, success, or loading, it knows that we must be in a ready context, loading context, or success context. And I'll reiterate that all of those, ready, loading, and success, all of these have restaurant defined. So let's say if we went back up here and said, or state.matches, we'll say error. Now, if this is the case, I guess it's actually failure, sorry. If this is the case, then we don't have restaurants on the type of failure because the restaurant could be undefined. So we'd have to do another check, but we prefer to just do our check with state.matches. Well, guys, that was another big one. Thanks for joining me again for yet another state management related tutorial. I hope you found this enlightening, and I also hope that you'll give this video a like. Que se cuiden. Hasta pronto. Ciao.